What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week's video is going to be some old abandoned kitchen appliances, continuing on the abandoned theme from the last few videos. I didn't have a lot of time this weekend, so just wanted to do some models that were a little bit easier and quicker to do. So I hope you guys enjoy the video and let's jump into it. So starting off with the oven model, I'm going to start off with a cube and then start blocking out the main shapes. And then I'm going to add in a few edge loops just so I can start planning where I want the objects on the model. Then I'm going to select those front faces and extract them from the object, just so I can separate them from the cube so I can use them later on to model my oven door and the bottom drawer. And then select those edges and extrude them in. Now that the main shape looks good, I can start beveling some corners. And then unhiding those faces I extracted, I can extrude those edges and bevel those corners as well. And then for the oven door window, I'm just going to go and select that object I already have below and duplicate it, just so I can use it to boolean out a hole for that place that the window is going to fit. And then after selecting both of those objects, I can boolean out a hole, and then a nice easy way to create some nice clean topology is just delete those faces, select both of the edges, and bridge them together. And then it's time to start beveling more corners. Now the original plan for this model was to be a higher poly model that was looking like it was abandoned and hasn't been used in a while. So what I'm going to do is start positioning these objects so they're a little bit slanted and off position, just so they look a little bit bent and look like they've been banged up over the years. Now for the bottom drawer, I want that corner to be bent out a little bit more, and as you can see, because of the polys, they're all attached to the middle, so that'll be a little bit difficult right now how the model's set up. So what I'm going to do is delete those front faces and start adding a few more polys, just so then it'll be easier to bend out that corner. And like I mentioned earlier, I want this to look abandoned and like it hasn't been used in a while and like the object a little bit beat up. So I'm going to start just moving some verts around and off positioning some of these objects just so everything doesn't look perfectly aligned. Now moving on to the handle for the drawer and the bottom tray, I'm just going to start off with another cube and then scale that into position. And like always, not worrying too much about topology at this point, just working freely with the model and the shapes. And then after, when I start UVing the object, I can start cleaning up the model and making it look a little bit better. for the bottom part, just starting off with another cube, and then I can go in and start beveling some of those edges. Now that the model's looking pretty good, I can create a few cylinders and start blocking out the positions of those knobs. While looking at some reference, I noticed that the plane that these knobs are sitting on is actually extruded a little bit and angled a little bit upwards. And it'll look cool and give the object a little bit more shape. So here I'm going to add a few edge loops so I can start planning out how I'm going to extrude that front face to give that slope and those knobs a little bit of a plane to sit on. So once that's looking good, I can start beveling some of those edges. Now because those edges meet up at a certain point at the top there, it will look a little bit messy, but that can easily be fixed with the target weld tool. So here I just select that, zoom in, and start merging some of those verts together. Bottom edge was looking a little bit too sharp, so here I can go and select those edges and move them up a little bit just so it rounds out that edge a little bit more. Now adding a few edge loops to those handles just so I can change those positions and make them look a little bit bent as well. So now that things are looking good, I can go select those cylinders I created earlier and boolean out some holes for my knobs. Now keep in mind, using the boolean tool is much easier with lower polys. So all of these cylinders are 8-sided, so all I have to do afterwards is just create a few edge loops and connect all of those verts. So here, rather than deleting those edges that Maya automatically creates during that boolean process, because they're not connected to anything, it would just delete those faces. So here I'm going to connect the verts first, and then I can go in afterwards and delete the unnecessary edges from the boolean. So I wanted one of those knobs to look a little bit different than the others, so I just wanted to add a few more edge loops and bevel a few more edges on this knob just to create a little bit more geometry to make it look a little different than the others. So now for the knobs themselves, I'm just going to start off with another cylinder and scale that and angle it into position of that hole that I created. So all I'm going to do for this knob is just increase the subdivisions up to 80. It's a higher poly model, so I'm not too worried about the poly count, and I want the edges to look nice and smooth. So I'm going to delete those front faces and start extruding out those edges. Now the more I looked at the reference, the more it kind of looked like a laundry detergent cap. So I just kind of blocking out those positions, and I can go in and bevel those edges afterwards. So now for the other knob, I do want it to look different than the first one I created. So starting off with another cylinder, I'm going to scale it to roughly the same size as that first knob, and then slide it over to the hole beside it. So a little trick I did to create this knob, and it also works well with creating flathead screws, is deleting all those front faces on a cylinder and then filling the hole. Now you have a face with no edges on it. So using the multi-cut tool, you can go ahead and just connect the verts depending on how thick you want that rectangle to be, and just extrude that outwards. And I basically have my knob already in position, and then I can go in afterwards and connect all those verts and just make sure they're all four-sided and all that. So here, because I was trying to work off that initial high poly knob, it was just a little more difficult. So because the cylinder to the right was a little lower poly, I decided to grab that and do the exact same process. And then quickly just connect some of those verts to make it a little bit more clean. And boom, just like that, we have some knobs. So now it's time to move on to the object that's actually holding these knobs into place. Because this object was abandoned and hasn't been used in a while, I imagine that some of these knobs actually would be missing. So to do that, I'm just going to start off with a square and then start blocking out that shape that I was looking for. So next is moving on to some screws that would be on this object. Now because it was so small, I probably could have just done this with texture and actually not added geometry for the screws, but because it's a high poly model, and why not just add those. So a lazy slash efficient quick way to create screws is just start off with a low poly sphere, and then I start off with the square and just make that cross Phillips head shape that I was looking for the screw. And then a nice easy lazy way to do that is just select both and boolean out that hole, and then you can go in afterwards and connect those verts. Like I said, it's a little bit on the lazy side to create some screws. There's probably way more efficient ways, but this is definitely a fast way to do it. Just you have to make sure to go in and clean up the object once you do that boolean. So the screw is looking good for the time being. Obviously when the UVing comes, I will clean it up a little bit more, but just for now it's looking good, so I can go ahead and scale that much smaller and fit that into position. I can then take that object, group it, and then duplicate it a few more times to fit behind where the other holes are. Alright, so now moving on to the side of the oven, I'm just going to go ahead and create an edge loop and then bevel that edge to create a square. I want little indents or little extrusions to be in on the sides just to give it a little bit more shape. A lot of these old styles as well have these like curved edges to them, so that's exactly what I'm going to do with the side here. So selecting those edges, I can extrude them inwards and then fill in the hole. Now to create that kind of curve look I was looking for, I'm just going to give a bevel to those front edges and the corners, and then leave the back ones alone so it creates that shape that I was going for. Now I usually clean it up more in the UVing process, but as you can see this was looking a little bit strange when I hit 3 on my keyboard to smooth it out. so I decided just to go in and clean up a few of these edges just to make it look a little bit better when it was smooth. Now that looks a little bit better, so now it's time to move on to the top part of the oven. So after looking at some reference of these old school ovens, that top face sinks in a little bit to where those elements sit. So to create that shape, all I'm going to do is delete all those front faces, and using the append to polygon tool, I can connect the faces on the outside to where this rectangle overhangs on the back end of the oven, and as well as the very front. And that just leaves me a nice empty square right in the middle to where I can create that little sinked in, dipped area where those elements are going to go. So then selecting those inner edges, I can just fill that hole and then just drag down that front face a little bit. So now quickly moving on to the back of the oven, I knew I wanted to have a different material here, like a different piece of metal was actually attached to the back. So go ahead and delete all these faces just to save me a room on the UV mat, and I can go create another cube and then scale that into position. So now just moving on to those stove elements, I'm just going to start off with another cylinder and then start blocking out those shapes. Now a lot of these old school ovens have these little vents on the very back, so to create those I'm going to start adding in some more edge loops. Now if I was worried about the polys, I could have just attached these closer to where those holes are and not actually have them go all the way around this rectangle shape. I wasn't too worried about that right now, especially during this process where I'm just creating the main shapes, so I'm going to start adding in a bunch of those edge loops to create all those holes that I need. And because I'm not going to go ahead and bevel these corners, when I hit 3 on my keyboard, that gives it that nice circle oval shape that I was looking for. So next up was moving on to those metal bars that sit on top of the elements and sit on top of the stove. So to do that, I'm going to create another cylinder and then basically duplicate one to have one horizontal and one vertical. And because they're combined as one object, I can go ahead and delete those faces, select those edges, and bridge them together. All I have to do is change the curve type to blend and then increase the divisions. It'll give me a nice bend to that pipe that I was looking for. So then I can go ahead and scale that nice and small. And here I'm just going to change that corner just to be a little bit more rounded, not as sharp. And then I can duplicate that object, flip it around to the other side of the stove, and then basically just bridge those two edges together. So now this metal bar is done, I can go ahead and start duplicating this and start positioning all the other ones that I need that sit on the very top of my oven. because I was going after that abandoned, beaten up look, I'm going to go ahead and add a few more edge loops, and then pressing B on my keyboard will give me this scale, this radius, that I can actually hold B and click and scale that smaller. Now what this does is just allows me to affect the polys that are around the area that I select, so I'm not only moving those selected polys, but depending on how big that radius is, it'll also move the polys that are close to it. So this way I can start bending some of these metal poles to make them look just not as perfectly straight, like they're beaten up and worn out over time. Now keep in mind, I didn't know what the final model was going to look like, so I was just playing around with some of the shapes and experimenting a little bit and just seeing what looked best. Now that I have the main shapes blocked out on the top of my stove, just to give my eyes a quick break, I'm going to jump to the back of the stove and start working on that back plane. So here I'm just going to add a few more edge loops, just to create some nice little indents that run vertically down this back metal piece. Now the back of this oven has a bunch of these holes. I guess they act as vents or something, so rather than creating all the holes, it'd make my life a little bit easier to create one row, and then I can duplicate that down afterwards. So I'm going to add in a few low poly cylinders so I can start booleaning out some holes. Very similar to what we did with those knobs on the front, I'm just going to do the same process on the back. And now using the target weld tool, I can go in and connect all these verts that are not connected from that boolean. Just want to make sure I get this row done correctly before I start duplicating this downwards, otherwise I'm just going to create more work for myself. Now that that row is looking good, I can select it, duplicate it, slide it down, merge those together, delete those faces, and then bridge together the edges. And basically just repeat that process a few more times till the whole back of the oven is complete. Next is adding a quick plane for my window. And then next up is jumping back onto the top of my stove just to start refining those shapes to get them closer to what I was looking for. And then next up is creating the nameplate that's on most appliances out there. So they usually sit on the front, so I'm going to start with another cube and then scale that nice and small. And then create a type mesh, which is under the create tab for the fonts, and then scroll through until I'm happy with the font. which is always actually surprisingly difficult. But I found something close to some sort of retro look I was looking for, and then I can scale that nice and small to fit onto my square plane. So after staring at my reference a little bit more, I realized there's only 3 elements on the top of the stove, and I've actually never seen that before. I've only seen stoves with 4 or more elements, so I thought that was pretty cool and different, so I decided to go along with that. So I just deleted one of these back elements and positioned the other one right into the middle, and then I started just to play around with the shapes a little bit more. So I was pretty happy with how everything was looking. I just wanted to add a little something extra just to make it look a little more interesting to the eye. So I thought it'd be cool to add a little cloth that was hanging out of that bottom drawer. So to do that, just start off with another cube, scale that nice and small, and then I can start extruding those edges just to bend them around like it's actually hanging over that metal drawer front cover piece. And then hitting 3 on my keyboard, I can smooth that object out until I get a shape that I was happy with. So that's basically everything for the stove. So next up was the fridge. So to do that, I'm going to start off with another cube and then start blocking out those main shapes. Now once those main shapes are done, it's time to start beveling some of those edges. Next up was creating another cube just to create that seal that's basically between the door and the fridge itself. So I'm just going to start blocking out those shapes. And then it's time to start blocking out the handle shapes. So starting off with another cube, I can scale that nice and small and get that into position. So now that the top handle is done, I can basically just mirror that to create the bottom one. So I can do that with the duplicate special tool, which is under the edit tab, and just duplicating that along the y-axis will just mirror that object. Now for the door hinges, I didn't really know how these worked exactly, and I had a few references I was looking at and they were all quite different from one another. So I was just playing around with the shapes until I got something I was happy with. front looked good, it was time to jump to the back. So now, similar to how we did the stove, I imagine this back metal piece to be different material than everything else on the fridge. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and create another cube and then scale that nice and small. Now, most of these old fridges and the references I was looking at had these metal poles that ran along the back ends. Now, I'm not exactly sure how these old fridges work, but I'm assuming that's just to help keep everything cold. So regardless of how it works, those objects needed to be there. So an easy way to do that was just to create a polygon torus. And I can, after scaling that nice and small, I can cut it in half and take those edges and basically just extrude them outwards. Now, because that metal plane is there, I'm not going to actually see how everything's connected, so I can use that to my advantage by just creating one that's chopped in half and just duplicate that over and over again. It just saves me work, saves me room on my UV maps, saves me just unnecessary polys. It's really good to cut these corners where you can and save on polys just on areas that aren't going to be viewed. It's just a good habit to get into. So now that the back was done, I'm just jumping back to the front of the fridge. It was looking a little bit plain, especially because I imagined both of these appliances were going to be your typical white texture, and it might look a little bit boring. So to add a little something extra, I thought it would be cool to add a few pieces of paper that maybe had like a foreclosure or an eviction sign on it, just maybe giving a little history to where these appliances originally came from. So to do that, I'm just going to start off with another cube, scale that nice and thin, just like a piece of paper, and then start positioning those on that front face of my fridge. And then I can take that nameplate I created on my stove and just duplicate that over for the nameplate on my fridge. Now, I didn't know how proportioned these objects should be to one another. Depending on the model of fridge and stove, you know, the fridge size can change depending on which models you have and stuff like that. I didn't want to get too specific, so zooming out, I'm just going to spend a little time changing the shape and scaling things up just to get something closer to what I had in mind. So I was pretty happy with how these models were looking, but I thought it would be nice to add one more object to help bring these models to life. So I decided to add a little old teapot that would be sitting on top of the stove. So to do that, I'm just going to start off with another cylinder and then start blocking out those shapes. That's basically everything for the model. I'm just going to go ahead and just change the position of this teapot a little bit, but that's basically everything. So I'm going to fast forward ahead to after I was done the UVing just to show you how I did all of those. So I ended up grouping everything into 3 different objects and 3 different textures. So fridge, pot, and stove. So here's the fridge UV. Obviously that far left face I could have straightened out a little bit more, but it looked good on the UV map, so I just decided to leave it. And next up was the pot, so nice and simple. Had a lot of room to work with for this guy, and then the stove as well. So as you can see with the checkered, everything looked nice and straight, and I was pretty happy with those. So one more thing also, I decided on the very back of the fridge just to add this cord that was coming out. I forgot to add that in the modeling process, and after I was done the UVs, I thought that's just one more element that should be there, as well as the floor. Because these appliances were probably all going to be white, I thought just adding a nice little floor texture might make it a little tiny bit more interesting. So that's basically everything, and now it's time to jump into Substance. Okay, so now in Substance Painter I can go and start a new project and load in my FBX from Maya. And everything looks good, so it's time to go to the texture set settings, hit bake mesh maps, switch that down to 4K, and make sure that box use low poly as high poly mesh is checked, and then bake selected textures. Now just before I get started with the textures, I do know I'm going to have an opacity texture on my window. So to do this, I'm going to go up to the top right corner of my shader settings and then change it from metal rough into alpha blending, and then I can jump back into my texture set settings and add an opacity channel. So now starting off with the stove, I'm going to start with a smart material. I have this steel painted worn texture. That looks pretty cool, so I'm just going to start off with that and then go in and tweak some of those settings. And then once I was happy with that material, I could then right click, set that to a black mask, and then using the mesh fill tool, I can just assign that to whichever mesh I wanted that texture applied. And then next up is moving on to the handles. So starting off with another smart material as a base, I'm going to choose Steel Ruined and start tweaking a few of those settings. And then just like the other, right click, set it to a black mask, and then assign it to those meshes. And then starting off with that Steel Ruin material again, I'm going to start working on those knob textures. That Steel Ruin material is going to be my best friend for this model. It looks really good, and it's great for this old abandoned look that I was going for. Next up was jumping to that top part of my stove. I was going to take advantage of that Steel Ruin texture again and just apply those to my elements. And then using that same material, I can go in and tweak the color to a little bit more of a yellow color to it, and start just painting on that all over the front face of my stove. And then using the eraser tool and choosing one of the dirt brushes, I can go and start erasing some of those hard edges that I created from that steel ruin material that I applied to the top of my stove. So erasing those hard edges will just make it look a little more realistic and like that material actually belongs there. I just want it to look like these top elements are really beat up from not only using those burners before when this appliance was functional, but just sitting there and eroding away over time. Next up was moving on to the poles, so for that I'm just going to start with the steel ruin texture once again, but this time just make it a little bit of a darker color and then apply it to all of those meshes. Next up was that little cloth that was hanging out of the drawer, so I'm just going to find a fabric material and apply that to the mesh. So next up was adding a little bit more wear to my stove appliance. I wanted to add a little bit of some drip effect, like some rust and dirt has been on there. So to do that, I'm going to start with a plastic material and choose an alpha that already came with Substance, so they have a couple of drip options to choose from. I just found one, scaled that up quite large, and then like usual just add on a lot more than I actually want, and then with the eraser tool afterwards I can go and take some away. So now I'm just going to go and add this drip effect in various places on the model. Just remember, this is one of those things where the longer you spend, the better it's going to look, and that's like most things obviously when it comes to texturing, but especially with drip effects and wear and tear, and the more colors and alphas and brushes you use will just make it look more realistic. So don't be afraid to keep layering on different things and using the eraser tool to take some back. Just play around with it until you get something you're happy with. So next up was the window. So to do that, I just assigned this glass film texture that comes with Maya. I just slid up the opacity slider. I didn't want it to be too opaque since there's no objects in the middle. And then I can go in and add a really cool texture to my roughness map. So I just found a really cool grunge leak material and applied that to the roughness. And that just makes that front window look really beaten up and dirty and weathered. And then next up was the fridge. So to do this, starting off with another smart material as a base, I chose a steel painted dirty texture and then started tweaking some of those settings. Once I was happy with the amount of wear and tear and the color of the fridge, I decided to go and add a plastic grainy material just to give the fridge a little bit of bump to the texture. So once I slid that under the base material, I could just change the scale to make those bumps very, very tiny, and it just adds a tiny bit of detail to that fridge. And then here I'm just going to select that steel ruin material again and then start adding that to the metal pieces on my fridge. And then I'm going to choose this rubber beaten up texture just to apply that to those rubber seals on my fridge. Next up was jumping to the pieces of paper. Now, I thought this would be cool to add a little foreclosure sign or something along those lines, as if these appliances once belonged to somebody and then they ended up getting kicked out and they haven't been used since, so they've just been abandoned and sitting there, basically eroding over time. So I found this template to a foreclosure agreement or something along those lines. It didn't really matter because I knew it wouldn't be too much in view. I just wanted to print on a big foreclosure stamp in red over top of this. So I just found something that was free on Google, save that as a JPEG and drag that right into my Substance project. Then I can assign that to the current session and assign that as a texture. And then basically I can just project this image right onto my piece of paper. I then just threw on this lined paper material, which I found on Substance Source, and then applied that to those pieces of paper as well, just to kind of give this wrinkly effect that paper has. And then starting off with the plastic material, I can go choose one of the fonts that comes with Substance as an alpha, and then basically I can just paste on that foreclosure print that I was talking about. So the fridge was looking pretty good, it was time to jump to the floor. So I knew I wanted to add a little bit of color or a little bit of something different because everything so far is basically white. So the floor was just an element to add a little more detail and make the objects just look a little more interesting. I was pretty torn between these two. I didn't know if I wanted wood paneling or this other abandoned just rough floor material. And I ended up actually choosing the abandoned factory floor texture, and I found this guy on Substance Source on their website, so check those out. There's so many materials on there you can add into your Substance library. And I just ended up choosing this one and tweaking some of those settings and a few of the colors and applying that to the floor mesh. And then last but not least was that little pot that was on top of the stove. So to keep things consistent, just decided to go with that steel ruin texture and just tweak a little bit of the settings and the colors and then apply that to the teapot. and then quickly jumping into the renderer to see how things are looking, and then also bring up that floor plane just to match up with the bottom of my mesh. As I'm spinning around, I just realized that I forgot to do the back of these objects, so quickly jump back to add some materials to those. So here I thought it'd be cool to add a little handprint or something on the back of the fridge, so I went ahead and chose one of those plastic materials, found a really cool alpha of a handprint, and then just applied that to that metal texture. And then I'm also just going to add a little bit of black dirt or grunge on the back of the fridge. It was looking a little bit too clean. And then next up was the back of the oven, so that just adding in a nice dark steel texture and then applying that to the mesh. So after taking a look back, I just thought it was looking still a little bit too plain, or I just wanted to add a little something extra, so I thought it'd be cool since they're abandoned to add a little graffiti. So I found some images on Google, some free to use images of random graffiti, saved those as JPEGs just like we did the piece of paper, drag those images right into my Substance project, assign those as textures, and then using the projection tool, I can just project those right onto my fridge. Then after I'm done pasting on that graffiti, I can go and change some blending mode to a multiply, and that way it'll just look like it blends into my material that's already on my fridge. And I did the exact same process with the side graffiti, but because the specularity was a little bit more, you could actually see the square that it was printed on. So just with the eraser tool, I can go in and just erase some of that. And then using the eraser tool and changing it to a dirt brush, I can go in and just erase some of the graffiti to make it look a little more worn out. And that's basically it for the textures. So I quickly jump into the renderer and mess around with the environmental map. I end up going with one of the soft low contrast. I found a lot of the lights just on the white color was making the white look very, very bright. But I was pretty happy with it. It turned out pretty cool. Doing abandoned objects are always my favorite. I love doing the wear and tear on the textures. So it was a lot of fun to make, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me out. And I'll see you guys in the next one.